in that vein. Are you ready for a story?
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel it. I'm ready for a story too. So once upon a time on an island that we're getting to know pretty well at this point, 6 months in of visiting the same locality again and again. Once upon a time on an island that is wreathed in fog, and this fog is so present, thick, curly, and gray that it was deserving of a name. And this fog was named Merlin's Beard, as it just wreathed this island constantly, and it moves in and out with weather patterns, but it seems to be ever present. And once upon a time, once before time, once in a time when gathering up on a full moon to hear a story wasn't a weird thing to do. It was the only thing to do. Once in a time like now, because all time is a once upon a time on that island, the king of a kingdom, and the king's name is Bran. Bran the Blessed, the Raven King, because Raven means Bran. Bran means Raven, and Raven means Bran. Bran and his brothers, Nisian and Efnisian and Manawydan, were all sitting on a high rock on a beach overlooking the coast. This rock was so big and protuberous that it got a name, and the name of this rock is Harlech. They're sitting on the beach and the rock at Harlech, and the waves are slamming the sea. And Efnisian and Nisian are Bran's brothers by Bran's mother. They're his half-brothers. And it's said of these twins that one of them could stop a war simply with his words. He had the capacity to stop conflict of that caliber simply by putting himself in the space and speaking good words. And that was Nisian. And Efnisian, his brother, it was said of Efnisian that Efnisian could make even the two most loving brothers quarrel so fiercely that it wouldn't stop until one of them died. So we have Bran, the Blessed, king of what we are going to call the Island of the Mighty. And something you should know about Bran is Bran is so big that he never was a house built that Bran could walk into. Bran is what we might call a giant and king of the Island of the Mighty, or Albion, or England. And as they sat there, as brothers do on the beach, staring off into the west towards Ireland and the setting sun, as they sat there, they saw coming over the water 13 swan-like graceful ships riding on the crests of waves. Riding the crest of waves. Ships, finer ships were never seen than these ships with full sail and their brocaded silk banners fluttering in the western wind off of Ireland. I can hear fairy music on the western wind off of Ireland. I've sat on a beach just south of Harlech, staring out on this same expanse, and you can hear the music coming from Ireland just over the waves. It's an incredible vision. And they sit there and they watch these ships. And Bran, the king, tells his brother Manawydan to go and to gather the army, gather the men, because there's 13 ships coming from Ireland. And things have been tense with Ireland for quite a long time, and they still are today. And so they gathered the men, and they all come down onto the beach. You can imagine this like horde of men with their king, who is a giant, sitting on a large rock above the above the beach, looking down on these 13 ships approaching. And then they see something unexpected. Out there on the 13 ships coming from Ireland, they see all of the shields of all of the warriors, the fierce Irish warriors. All of their shields are held upside down above the sides of the ship in this, I guess, at this time, international sign of peace. We come in peace, we come for conversation, not for battle. With these ships, these white shields raised upside down above the sides of the ships, these graceful swan-like ships coming across the water. It's almost like the white shields are swan feathers on these ships, decked out as they glide across the water from Ireland. And the ships land, and a small party of Irishmen get off onto the sand and approach the army of the Island of the Mighty. And they're stopped in their tracks by the armies, and the commander, who's down on the beach, says, "What is your business here? Why have you come? What is your business here?" And they say, "Well, our king, Matholwch, has a question for Bran, king of the Island of the Mighty." And they say, well, Bran speaks up there from the rock. And imagine what it would feel like. You're talking to someone your own size. And then out of nowhere, the voice of a giant starts booming above you. "Does he wish to come on to land? Does he wish to come on to the Island of the Mighty?" And the messengers from Ireland are quaking in their boots. But they say, "Not unless you say he can. But he does have a question for you, and he's on the ship." And King Bran, the Raven King, up there, "Well, what is his question?" He wishes to join Ireland and the Island of the Mighty, to join them together by joining the family of Matholwch and the family of Bran the Breasted by marrying your sister Bronwen. And Bronwen, her name means the White Raven. And it is said of Bronwen that either she was one of the Welsh word translates two ways. One of the three chief maidens of the Island of the Mighty, or one of the three chief ancestors of the Island of the Mighty. And I like to think about her as one of the three chief ancestors of the Island of the Mighty. And maybe all people from that part of the world are descended from Bronwen. Well, Bran, king of the island, invites Matholwch onto land, and as we've seen, and it comes over me, Byron. As we've seen through all these stories, marriage is a quirky and outdated thing in this world. And so Matholwch and his counselors and Bran and his counselors sit down at the castle above Harlech and engage in a conversation about what might be the way that these two kingdoms could come together. What would be the marriage terms of Bronwen to marry Matholwch, king of Ireland, and to leave Ireland to go? What would need to happen? And after some time passes in myths in strange ways, so we don't know how long, but after some time they come to some sort of agreement that Bronwen will marry Matholwch of Ireland. She'll be given to the Irish to unify these two great kingdoms. And so they plan a huge feast somewhere further south, towards the south tip of Wales, called Aberdyfi. And the men of the Island of the Mighty march there across land. And the Irishmen return to their ships, and they ride their ships on the swift wind south, and they meet up again at this castle at Aberdyfi, and they have a most glorious wedding ceremony. Incredible. The White Raven, Bronwyn, bedazzled in all sorts of incredible silver. The feast was incredible, and at the feast, they sat Bran in the middle, and Bronwyn next to him, and then Matholwch, King of Ireland, Manawydan, and Nisian, all there at the high table together. And they had an incredible feast, and when it seemed to be better to go to sleep than to continue carousing and drinking, they all went to sleep, and that night Matholwch and Branwen slept together, and the marriage was completed and brought together. And there's a way in which marrying for power is an interesting thing, but also marrying to marry pieces of land together is there's something so beautiful about that, especially places that have been at war. There's this marriage, there's this beauty, and there's this true celebration that happens. Well, as you might imagine, Irish warriors bring lots of horses with them. It's a whole army there. So they brought their whole army, they have all their horses, and all their horses are stabled around Aberdyfi at all of the hamlets and the holts and the villages. And this party goes on for days and days and days, and it's the same thing every night. They party and they drink and they sing and stories are told. Taliesin shows up, tells stories, and it's incredible. The wedding itself could have lasted for years, until one day Efnisien, we remember him, Efnisien is roaming around the countryside and comes to a village and sees that the stable is completely filled with resplendent, beautiful, sacred Irish horses. So incredibly beautiful. And so he goes to the stable master to inquire, where did these wonderful, beautiful, resplendent, sacred Irish horses come from? And he says, haven't you heard? Branwen has been given in marriage to Matholwch, King of Ireland. These are the horses of the Irish army, the best horses of Ireland, stabled here in my humble stable. It's the honor of a lifetime to take care of such incredible beasts. So Efnisien says to him, so that is how I've been betrayed. They've given away my sister in marriage to some Irish prick without even consulting me. And he pulls out his sharp blade from his belt and proceeds to cut the ears off of every horse down to the bone, to cut the eyelids off of every horse down to the bone, to cut off their lips and their tails. It's horrendous. It's evil. It's terrible, but this is what he does. Efnisien, in this stable, maims every single horse, and then continues to the next village and maims every horse, and continues on this path of fury and rampage, maiming every Irish horse that has been brought to the island. At some point, word gets to Matholwch, King of Ireland, remember, and his counselors. And the counselors say, How are we still here when these Englishmen, these Welshmen, are insulting us in such grand fashion? We need to leave now. Obviously, they do not want peace. And Mathalhook says, "It's a strange way to insult me, to marry me to their sister, the chief ancestor, one of the 3 chief maidens of the islands, and then to go about slaughtering all of my horses. There must be something wrong," but the counselors convince him that it's an insult directed at him, that the English, these Welshmen, do not want peace, and that there's something brewing. And so Mathalhook and all of the Irish leave in the middle of the night without telling anyone where they're going to go. And did not take Bronwyn. They leave Bronwyn. And they leave. And the King Bran wakes up the next morning to an empty castle after days and days and days of feasting and connecting with his new brother-in-law and the family. And is outraged at the lack of convention and following of proper norms of royalty to at least ask permission to leave the kingdom when you're leaving. And so he sends messengers after the Irish. And when the messengers catch up with Mathalhook, they're kind of fed this story from Mathalhook's counselors. You've insulted us. Every single horse that we brought with us here, our most beautiful prized horses, the mounts of our whole army, have been maimed, and you've done it to break the peace. And Bran's behind the whole thing. The king is behind the whole thing. It's all his fault, and he's trying to make us stuck here and get us embroiled in conflict. And the messengers from the king assure the Irish counselors that Bran knows nothing about it. He would have never done something so obscene. And if Mathalhook will only come back, they might be able to. Let's figure this out. Essentially, let's figure this out. He tells them to come back so they can figure out what to do. And they say, okay, well, we don't really think that that's gonna work. Like, you're not offering us anything, but we'll go tell the king. We'll go tell Mathalhook and try to get him to come back. And essentially they tell him, come back with a better offer. come back with a better offer. And so they do. They go back to King Bran. They say they think that you did it. They think that these horses that have been maimed, that it was all of this ploy. And at this point, rumors have started to crop up, and they're starting to figure out that it was Efnisian who did this. And so Bran tells his messengers to tell Mathalhook's counselors that he knows who did it. He knows it was Efnisian. He knows it was his brother. And Efnisian's his brother. And he can't just kill his brother. He has a duty of honor to his brother. But he'll figure out what to do with him. And if they come back, that Mathalhook can have a plate of gold as broad as his face, and a staff of silver as thick as his pinky finger and as tall as he is. So 2 precious metallic artifacts will be given as an honor price for the loss of the horses, and that the Island of the Mighty will replace every horse that was lost with the best horse that they can find from their own stables. Messengers go back, to the Irishmen, tell them this. They go take counsel, and they agree that they'll come back. So they have another feast, and as we've got the same setup, it's Bran sitting in the middle with Mythalhook and Branwen next to him. There's conversation happening, but Bran has this sense that Mythalhook is not as happy and jovial as he was the last time they feasted together before all of this went down. And he gets it in his head that it's because he hasn't offered enough in recompense for the atrocious deed of his brother. And so he says this. Yeah, he calls him out. He says, you're not having as much fun as you were the last time that you were here. I can tell. You're not having that much fun. And I have a feeling it's because you think that I haven't given you enough. And he said, and before Mythalhook can say anything, he says, okay, I'm going to give you a cauldron. I'm going to give you this magic cauldron that I have. This incredible magic cauldron. And the property of the cauldron is that if you take someone who died in battle and you put them in the cauldron, they will spring up the next morning alive out of the cauldron. The thing is, they won't be able to talk anymore, but they will be alive and ready to fight again. This cauldron of zombie warrior creation I will give to you. He says, in the source text, he literally just says, God repay you, Mythalhook back. He doesn't say anything, he just says, God repay you. Thanks for your generosity, period. And time goes, feast continues. And then he gets curious. Where exactly did you get this cauldron? Where exactly did you get this cauldron? And so Bran, King Raven of the Island of the Mighty, unfolds this story. Well, I got the cauldron from a giant who came to the Island of the Mighty from your kingdom, from Ireland. But I assume you don't know anything about it, since you're asking me. And that jogs Mythalhook's memory. Mythalhook says, oh, I know that giant. And so Bran asks him, why did he come to the Island of the Mighty from Ireland? And he says, well, I've got a story. And so he begins to tell him this story. One day he was hunting above a lake called the Lake of the Cauldron. And out of it came stomping a tall, red-haired man. An incredibly huge red-haired man with a cauldron on his back. And followed him an even more incredibly huge red-haired woman out of the lake. And it's probably important to know that in Welsh folklore and Welsh mythology, lakes are the gates to the other world. And they come walking out of the lake. And impressed by their magnificent and magnitudinous size, he invites them to come and live in the kingdom. Mythalhook, King of Ireland, invites them to say, you're pretty cool. You're pretty huge. You got this cool cauldron. You should come live with us. And he invites them to live with us. And the giant says, we'll come live with you, but you should know that my wife is pregnant. And by next week, she will give birth. And by 2 weeks after that, our son will be a grown man ready to fight. Got speed time. And so this pregnant giantess and her giant lover go and live in the center of the kingdom of Ireland. And for a while it's good. And they integrate into the community. He's an incredible smith. And the children are fast learners, and join the Irish war machine. And but then rumors of how just profane they are, how much profanity they're constantly talking, are inflaming across the land. People are insulted constantly by the rough and rude and rowdy talk of these giants and their giant children. And they start this campaign of rumor and satire against these giants that finally comes back to the counselors of Mytholwic, who, in their way, convince Mytholwic that they need to get rid of these giants. They're just too much of, and they're insulting people, and people are uncomfortable, and they need to get rid of them. And so they gather up all of the smiths in the land, and they make a house completely out of iron. Every single wall hand forged of iron, and they invite the giants to come live in this incredible iron house that's big enough for a giant. And they set the table inside with an incredible feast every day. And so the giants move into this incredible iron house. And one day, after a particularly huge feast with extra ale, the Irish smiths come and lock the door and take the coals from every single one of their fires and pile them in great heaps around the iron walls of the house. and then blow on the coals and attempt to roast the giants. I'm back. Well, I guess it was too R-rated. Giants for roasting. And, well, you can imagine how it goes being inside of an iron house. I don't want it on gallery. Okay, thank you. Well, the giant father busts free out in this rage and pulls his wife from the iron house. And the children who are in there, sadly, don't have the same fate. They don't escape the iron house. And this is how the cauldron got to the island of Mighty, because the two giants ran from the iron melting house and across the sea, waded across the sea. So that is the story of the cauldron. Hideous, horrendous. Who chose this story? So this is the story they're telling each other. Well, he accepts the gift of the cauldron, takes it back to Ireland, and to take it back to Ireland. And the very next day, the Irish return to their ships with Bronwyn this time. On a happy note, reconnected. As you know, there's been recompense. The correct honor price has been paid for the wound in the eyes of the counselors and Mytholwic. And Bronwyn is, going along with this political marriage and is taken to Ireland. And it is said of Bronwyn's arrival in Ireland that the streets were lined with people. It was this incredible homecoming of the Irish army, but also this arrival of some holy vision, some sacred vision from another world. And that when she arrived at the kingdom, at the heart of the kingdom, at Tara, that she sat there on her throne for months on end. And every time someone came No one came to Tara and didn't leave bedazzled and bedecked in silver and precious metals and stones directly from Bronwyn. She gave away everything to the people. No one left without something incredible from visiting Tara and meeting Bronwyn. And it went on like this, and Bronwyn became pregnant with Matholwch's child, and the proper time passed, and the child was born, and they named him Gwern. They named him Gwern. And Gwern was born this happy, beautiful birth, and then taken and fostered to the best family they could find in Ireland. And then this rumor machine, this rumor mill we've already encountered started to churn again. And stories and tales of the insult that the Irish had suffered at the hands of Efnisien in the island of the Mighty began to flare up and turn into fireside stories and pub corner chats all across the land. This great insult of the maiming of the Irish horses, until it gained so much vibrational energy that it got back to the center of the kingdom at Tara. It was as if the whole island was shaking with the reverberation of this insult that had already been recompensed. The rumor mill, has its own power, and so it began to shake and crumble, and this seemingly happy arrangement began to fall apart. And the counselors of Matholwch came to Matholwch and said, "Listen, it's not enough. It was never enough. We got to listen to the people. We can't have Bronwyn here. The people from the island of the Mighty have insulted us too gravely, and you can't have Bronwyn here. And in fact, we think we should punish her as an act of giving the people what they want." And so they take her off her throne, and they take away her crown, and they send her to live in the room behind the kitchen and to work kneading the dough for the bread of the kingdom, completely stripped of her position. And these sources are so just dry. They were written down, by scholars, monks, scholars, and they're so dry, and sometimes it's hard to even find the water in them, the grief of that kind of experience of being stripped of this life that you have. I don't even know if I can touch it, but being stripped and taken away from everything you've ever known and put in this whole other life. And then on top of it, they make the butcher come every day and box her on the ear with his meat-covered head. So this goes on for 3 years. And in that time, all trade between Ireland and the island of the Mighty has been completely shut down. Anyone who arrives in Ireland from the island of the Mighty is imprisoned because they don't want any word of what is happening with Bronwyn to get back to her home. So they completely just cut off international relations. because I think because they're so ashamed of what they're doing, and they know that it's hideous. And either that or they just don't want to get caught. And through all of those 3 years, Branwen goes each spring to the starling nest in the eaves underneath the window of this little cell that she's been said to live in. And she takes one of the fledgling starlings, and every year she raises it on the edge of her dough trough, every day kneading her dough, and telling her story of this, what she's experienced, to the baby starling, and feeding it and helping it to grow until it's old enough that it begins to talk in her voice and to tell her story. And it masters her story, and it speaks in her voice until it's old enough to fly away. And it flies away. And it flies towards home, her home. And every year she does this. And there's some magic in the 3rd year that this starling that she's lovingly raised to sing in her voice her story, that can't be heard any other way because of this embargo. The bird flies. It's been told so many times of the giant Raven King Bran of the Island of the Mighty that it flies directly across the sea from Ireland to the king sitting on his rock at Harlech, grieving the loss of his sister, grieving this international breakdown. He doesn't even know what happened over there, what's going on. Suddenly all word was gone 3 years ago, and he's heard nothing. He's sitting there grieving, and the starling comes and lands on his hand as he sits there in grieving with open palms, and begins to speak the story of his sister in his sister's voice to him. And he hears it, and there's a storm. There's a storm of rage and fury and grief and pain and loss at hearing the story of what happened to his sister. And he gathers they say that he gathered the armies of 157 districts of the Island of the Mighty and put them all on ships and headed out towards Ireland. But he's so large that he walked across the sea to Ireland with every single musician and poet in his whole kingdom on his shoulders. And so this giant king walks across the sea with the sound of the most brilliant and virtuosic musicians and poets of the kingdom exploding from him. And if we remember Taliesin's job was to go out before the battle even started and cast such curses with his voice and eloquence that the battle didn't even need to happen anymore. So we've got this cacophony of sound and music and curses and poetry that are just erupting from the king as he walks across the sea with a forest of ship masts next to him as it moves, this musical mountain and its forest marching across the sea. And it just so happened that 3 swineherds were sitting on the beach in Ireland watching their pigs eat in the dune grasses. And they looked out and they saw a giant mountain with 2 lakes of fire on its side, and a forest coming across the sea. A forest of trees and a mountain with lakes of fire moving across the sea. Well, you best believe that if you saw something like that, you would be running to someone who might know what's going on. And so they ran to Tara, the hill of Tara where the king is, and they told the king and his counselors, and they said something strange. They said, no one will know what is happening unless Bronwyn knows what's happening. No one will know what's happening unless Bronwyn knows what's happening. And so they go and get Bronwyn. And they say, and when they arrive, they say, my lady Bronwyn, can you tell us what's happening? And she says, well, I am no lady. You've made me no lady, as I've been sitting here toiling in this kitchen, being beaten by this butcher for the last 3 years, stripped of my life. But I do know what's happening. And they say, well, what is the forest coming across the sea? And she says, well, that is the ship's masts of every ship in the fleet of the island of the mighty coming towards Ireland. And what is the mountain? The mountain is my brother waiting across the sea to come. He's heard my story and he's coming. And what are the lakes of fire? The lakes of fire are his red eyes, red with blood and tears from crying at the grief and tragedy of what you've done to me. The lakes of fire are his eyes, his red eyes that are raw with grief for what you've done to me. Well, they muster their army, and they realize they're no match, and the counselors say this, what we do is we draw them to the river Liffey. And the river Liffey, there's something special about it. The bottom of it is covered in lodestones. And lodestones are magnets that are strong enough to rip the nails out of ships and sink them. So no ship can ever cross the river Liffey. So if we pull them to the river Liffey and we destroy the bridge, there'll be no way for them to get us. And so this is what they do. When the army from the island of the mighty arrive, they meet no resistance, and they see a small party, and they're drawn to the river Liffey in Ireland. And they know that there's lodestones, and so the commanders come to Bran and they say, what do we do? There's lodestones. We can't take our ships. And he says this. Well, they say there's no bridge. And he says this. He who would be a leader must be a bridge. He who would be a leader must be a bridge. And so he lays down across the river Liffey. And every single member of his army walks across the king's back over the river to the center of Ireland. The Irish army sees this happening and they know that there's no fight to be had, and so they come up with, the counselors and the king come together, and the plan they come up with is this. We don't want to fight, and what's the one thing that Bran has never been able to do that he probably would want to do? And that is to be able to go inside of to have a feast inside of a house. Because Bran is so large that there's no house that he has ever had a feast in. He always feasts in tents. Forgot to say. He always feasts in tents. And so they set to work building this massive house that's big enough for the two armies to have a feast in, and big enough for Bran to attend in this massive house. And that is what they offer to the king. They say, we will give you this massive castle house, and Matholwch, King of Ireland, will step down as king, and make Gwern, your son, or your nephew, Gwern, king of Ireland. He's about 4 years old. So we'll have to be, king through a regent. But we'll make him king. We'll invest him with the kinghood. Bran accepts because he knows that they're not going to make him king of Ireland. But this is close enough. It's his nephew. And him and his sister Branwen are pretty close. And so they build this incredible house. And they invite everyone for a feast. And then they do something sly. On 100 pillars inside the house, they hang 100 bags filled with flour. And inside the bags of flour, an assassin, an Irish assassin, hides. And so at the feast, they're going to bust out. It's going to be the Red Wedding. It's going to be a hellacious series of bloodsheds. And everyone is arriving. And who is it that arrives first to the feast but Efnisien himself, the one who started all of this bad business? And he goes into the house. He walks up to the bags of flour, because a rogue knows a rogue. A spade calls a spade, and he sees the trick. And he walks up to the bag of flour, and he begins to feel around on the bags of flour. And he feels the head of the assassin inside of the bag. And the gory details aside, 100 times, he does some brain squishing and undoes this trick that's to be had. So 100 bags dripping with gore and are hanging in this hall, and they have a feast anyway. And it gets worse, everybody. It just gets worse. So just just prepare. It just gets worse. This is the story, and this is how it happened. So they're having their feast, and Gwern is being introduced to his uncles for the first time. And so he's hanging out with his uncle Bran, the king. It's sweet. It's a little boy and this giant. And he then goes and he's introduced to Manawydan, his other uncle. It's this sweet connection. And he walks over to Nisian. And it's a sweet connection. Remember, Nisian can stop any conflict with just his words. Where was he this whole time? Where was he the whole time? I wonder that. And then Efnisien says, "What? I'm your uncle too. You don't want to meet me?" From across the fire. Everyone hesitates. This guy's bad for business. But they don't want to insult anyone. So Bran says, "Okay, boy, go and meet your uncle." And he walks across the fire. He walks around the fire to his uncle Efnisien. And Efnisien thinks to himself, "I am about to do the most dishonorable thing I have ever done." I'm about to do, and it will echo through history as one of the most dishonorable actions that a man could take. And as his nephew walks to him, he grabs him and chucks him into the fire at the center of the hall. His mother screams and attempts to dive into the fire and is stopped by her brother Bran. And then all out bloodshed begins to happen in this castle. There's just war erupts instantly in this echoing scream, and then clang of swords, and this clang of swords, and it never ends. And at some point, the Irishmen begin to gather their dead and put them into this cauldron of rebirth. And they just keep coming back up, never able to speak again, but ready to fight. And this war is raging across all of Ireland. It busts out from the confines of the castle across the whole kingdom. And Efnisien, having done this, says, well, I must stop it. For some reason, there's this change. This trickster character changes in this moment. He says, I have to stop it. And so he throws his body into the pile of dead Irishmen and lays there. And at some point, his falsely dead body is taken and thrown into the cauldron of the rebirth. And as he hits the bottom of the cauldron, he puts out all four of his limbs and shatters the cauldron with this great thrust of force with all four limbs and shatters the cauldron. And without the cauldron of the rebirth, what victory is to be had in this conflict goes to the men from the island of the mighty, and only 7 of them leave. And it is said that every single person in Ireland, except for 5 pregnant women, died in that conflict. And these 5 pregnant women fled to a cave where they all gave birth at the same exact moment. And their children, their descendants, are the ancestors of every Irish person on the planet currently. But the 7 who survived from the island of the mighty leave, and 8 of them actually, because Bronwyn is with them. And during the conflict, King Bran was stabbed in the foot with a poisoned spear. And instead, he tells his men that there's no way you can carry my body, and I'm going to die anyway. So what you should do is cut off my head and take it with you back to the hill of London and bury it there. But first, you'll go to Harlech, and you'll spend 7 years there, and my head will be extraordinary company. So they ride their ships back to Harlech. And when Branwen's feet touch the shore of home, she feels the utter weight of loss of her child and her life and her brother, and her heart breaks, and she dies there on the beach. And they bury her in an old way with a 4-sided grave there on the beach, on the dunes above Harlech. And they go to the castle, and they feast for 7 years in the company of the severed head, which sings poetry and song to them. And in some way, their grief is alleviated for 7 years at this massive, horrendous thing. But at the end of the 7 years, the head tells them that they have to go south to another castle where they will feast for 80 years in the company of the birds of Rhiannon and the head. And as long as they never open the door south to Cornwall, they can stay there. But if they ever open this door south to Cornwall, they'll have to take the head to London and bury it and end their reverie. And so they do. They leave. They go to this other great castle. They go to this other great castle, and they feast in the company of the birds of Rhiannon, which are magic birds with incredible songs of grief and life and rebirth. And the head jokes and tells stories and alleviates their grief, and they feel none of the pain of the incredible atrocity that they've experienced and that they were a part of for 80 years. Until one day, one of the 7 says, this life of paradise is no life in the face of all the things we know have happened but we refuse to attend to, and opens the door to Cornwall. And suddenly, all of the loss floods back into them. All of the grief, all of the violence and the terror that they have experienced and committed floods back in. And they leave this procession of grief and loss across the land to go and conceal Bran's head at London. And they say that Bran's face was face towards France, and as long as Bran's head was buried under the hill of London, where now the Tower of London with its black ravens is, as long as the head was concealed there, no foreign invader would ever come to the island of the mighty. At some point, it was unearthed, maybe in the time of Arthur, when we have lots of invasions. And for that reason, this story is called either Bran or Branwen, or the Assembly of the Severed Head. And it's an atrocious one, and it's the one that came tonight. And that is all I know. The end. So, I can imagine that there's a lot, I feel a lot stirring from that story that isn't that pleasant in my body, so maybe just not take it, shake it out in whatever way works for you. Just shake it out. It was long, and it was a lot. It was a lot. I'm gonna put on gallery view so I can see. Yeah. What was he doing? That his magic power would come in handy that whole time. I don't know where he was. So, I think we should feed the story, even if it's a story that we're not feeling like we really want to feed.
Ugh.
Yeah. Horses. So, yeah, any images that are haunting you, any images that felt actually good inside of all of that atrocity, anything that's alive for you.
Starling.
Yeah.
Shoulder bones. The Iron House.
Across the sea.
I like the ships with the white swan feather shields.
Three beers of kneaded bread.
The fog was thick and swirling gray. The fog was named Merlin's beard. If a leader is a true leader, there'll be a bridge. And the forest of the ship, masts of the ships.
Red-haired giant.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Very good friend of mine, the artist here. He actually introduced me to much of the people I know. My discovered she was from Latvia. She spoke Latvian.
Well, the marriage for the union of warring lands. Well, don't want to stew in it for too long here. Oh, my computer's gonna freeze and close Zoom probably, but for those of us here, you know, I think part of what we experience as the birds of Rhiannon and the box with the meat covered cudgel every day. That was terrible. part of what we experience of what stories are supposed to do in this culture is that they're supposed to like make us feel good about ourselves. Most of the time we just like hear these heroes' journey stories. We're like, yeah, everything's golden and great, and we're good. We feel good about ourselves, and I think that's really powerful stuff. That's really powerful stuff, and it feels really good to hear those kinds of stories. And this story is obviously something completely different. It's something completely different, and so I'll just say, with that I am not trying to endorse any polemic. I'm not trying to say that we should live our lives based on any of the morals in that story, any of the guiding capacities, except for maybe telling our stories to birds so that they can speak across boundaries that we never could as humans. I think that's the magic thing inside that story. That is the reason I chose it. I chose it for that 1 5-second image. And so with that, I'm going to say goodnight to that story. And maybe there's someone, maybe Kiara, do you have a song? Does anyone have a redemptive song or poem that we could say goodnight? Great, thank you.
You go in the dark, the light is to know the light. To know who does go dark, go without sight. Find that the dark to and sing, and is traveled by dark feet and dark wings. To go in the dark, the light is to know the light. To know who does go dark, go outside. You'll find that dark to blooms at the sea, and is traveled by dark feet and dark wings.
So that was a Wendell Berry poem that our friend Katie Hicks put to music that Maureen is saying. That the words are, to go in the dark with a light is to know the light. To know the dark, go without sight. And you'll find that the dark too blooms and sings and is traveled by dark feet and dark wings. And that's a good place to end. Thank you. Thanks for coming. Come back next month for something cheery and redemptive. We'll see you then.
Thank you, love.
Bye. Thanks, Jay.